In the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest and Great Lakes, the nearest doctor was 3 days away. Number 17 is from a tree the industry called worthless until it became a billion-dollar cancer drug. Number 9 stopped infections and wounds that had no business healing. These are 25 remedies lumberjacks used when help was days through the forest. Number 25, Douglas fir resin for wounds and chest. The sticky amber resin from Douglas fir bark sealed deep axe cuts with a waterproof antimicrobial barrier that prevented the contamination that made forest injuries so dangerous in a wet climate where bacteria thrived year-round. The same resin, inhaled as steam, opened congested airways during the respiratory infections that swept bunkhouses every winter. Abutane deterpents in fir resin have confirmed broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity against common wound pathogens. The camp cook who kept a jar on the shelf maintained a wound dressing and a chest treatment in the same container. Number 24, red alder bark for pain and fever. Alnus rubra contains salicin, the same compound in white willow bark, which the body converts to salicylic acid for fever reduction and pain management. Coastal indigenous peoples had used red alder for skin conditions and rheumatic pain for generations before any logging camp existed. Lumberjacks who learned the plant from indigenous neighbors or from experienced woodsmen chewed the bark or brewed it as tea for the joint pain accumulated from years of axe work in cold, wet conditions. The tree that foresters considered a weed species because it was not commercially valuable timber was the camp's most available pain medicine. Number 23, Sitka spruce resin for infected wounds. Campmen who had worked the coast long enough knew to collect Sitka spruce resin specifically for the wounds that had already turned, the ones showing the red streaking that meant infection was moving toward the blood. The resin was applied directly, warm, pressed into wound margins, and held with a cloth wrap. Research on Picea species resins has confirmed significant antimicrobial activity against the gram-positive bacteria most responsible for wound sepsis. The tree that produced the finest aircraft wood in the world, Sitka spruce framed World War I aircraft frames for its unmatched strength-to-weight ratio, was also growing antimicrobial medicine in its bark. Number 22. Western red cedar bark for wounds and fever. Thuja plicata inner bark, applied to infected wounds, delivered thujone and volatile compounds with confirmed antimicrobial properties. The same chemistry that makes cedar oil an effective insect repellent also makes it hostile to the bacteria that colonize damaged tissue. Coastal peoples who had worked with cedar for thousands of years had developed bark preparations, and camp cooks absorbed that knowledge through proximity and necessity. A material used for canoes, baskets, and longhouse construction was simultaneously a medicine. The logging industry encountered this pattern repeatedly. Trees served multiple purposes, and their medicinal properties were inseparable from their cultural ones. Number 21, Cascara sagrada for constipation. Rhamnus porciana bark, stripped and aged at least 1 year before use, contained cascaricides that stimulated intestinal motility reliably within 6 to 8 hours. Camp diets heavy in salt pork, beans, and bread produced the constipation that crowded conditions made additionally uncomfortable, and cascara was what the forest provided. The United States Pharmacopoeia recognized Cascara sagrada in 1890. The Food and Drug Administration classified it as a safe and effective over-the-counter laxative in 1975. The bark that lumberjacks stripped for their own relief became a pharmaceutical product that remained on pharmacy shelves for over a century. A supply chain nobody planned. Number 20. Devil's Club bark for infection and diabetes. Oplopanax horridus root bark, despite the plant's formidable armed exterior, was the pharmacologically significant medicine that Haida, Tlingit, and Salish healers used for infections, joint inflammation, and what we now recognize as type 2 diabetes. Research has confirmed alpha-glucosidase inhibitory activity in Devil's Club preparations, the same molecular mechanism targeted by pharmaceutical diabetes medications. Logging camp men who learned Devil's Club from indigenous workers were accessing a plant whose diabetes chemistry a research team confirmed more than a century later. Number 19. Black cottonwood buds for muscle pain and wounds. Populus trichocarpa resinus buds infused into lard over gentle heat produced a balm that camp men applied to overworked muscles and the minor wounds that daily heavy labor generated continuously. The salicylate chemistry delivered aspirin-equivalent anti-inflammatory compounds through the fat base. The aromatic compounds provided additional antimicrobial activity. Great Lakes camps using balsam poplar buds and Pacific Northwest camps using black cottonwood arrived at the same preparation independently, a convergent discovery that reflected the consistent pharmacological value of the Populus genus across two very different geographies. Number 18. Horsetail as wound styptic and bone support. Equisetum, growing in dense stands along every logging camp creek, was the wound styptic for cuts bleeding more than they should. The high silica content creates a physical hemostatic effect when the crushed plant is pressed against a bleeding wound. The same silica has been studied for bone mineralization, consistent with traditional applications for fractures in multiple cultural traditions. A 2016 study confirmed significant bone density supporting activity in horsetail extracts. The plant growing along every camp creek was field styptic and long-term bone support simultaneously, though nobody in the camp was thinking about it in those terms. Here is what isolated the logging camp from every other medicine situation covered on this channel. A mining camp, at least, had a town within a day's ride. A frontier farm had neighbors within reach. The deep timber camps of the Olympic Peninsula and the Great Lakes North Woods were sometimes genuinely unreachable for 3 to 5 days under normal conditions. In those conditions, the camp cook was not a substitute for a doctor. The camp cook was the only medical professional that existed. Some of them were extraordinary, maintaining field surgical kits, keeping records of what worked, developing protocols for the specific injuries that logging produced that no medical textbook addressed. The knowledge they carried was not written down. When the camp closed, it moved with them, or it did not move at all. Number 17. Pacific yew bark, the tree that became Taxol. Taxus brevifolia was considered worthless timber by the logging industry. Too small, too hard to work, commercially valueless. Indigenous peoples of the Northwest used the bark for rheumatic pain and as a general tonic. In 1962, a United States Department of Agriculture botanist collected yew bark samples as part of a broad survey of potential anti-cancer plants. The compound isolated, paclitaxel, marketed as Taxol, became one of the most important chemotherapy agents ever developed. It is now used against ovarian, breast, and lung cancer. The tree the logging industry threw away contained a compound that generated billions in pharmaceutical revenue. The people who knew its value were never asked. Number 16. Lungwort lichen for respiratory illness. Labaria pulmonaria, the large green lichen draped on old-growth trees, was used in European herbal medicine for respiratory illness and was carried into the Northwest through contact between indigenous practices and settler traditions. The lichen contains stictic acid and compounds with confirmed antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties against respiratory pathogens. A 2015 study documented significant antimicrobial activity against the bacteria most associated with pneumonia. The lichen, hanging from old-growth branches, treated the same condition the sawdust-filled air was causing. Number 15. Salalberry for nutrition and wounds. Gaultheria shallonberries provided vitamin C and antioxidant compounds during winter months, when camp diets were most nutritionally restricted. The leaves contain arbutin, the urinary antiseptic compound in Uva ursi, along with tannins, creating an astringent, wound-healing environment when applied as a poultice. Coast Salish and Haida peoples had used salal medicinally for generations, and loggers who worked alongside indigenous crews learned what the shrub covering the ground between the trees actually was: food and medicine in the same plant, available in unlimited quantity. Number 14. Red huckleberry for scurvy prevention. Vaccinium parvifolium berries provided enough vitamin C to prevent the bleeding gums and slow wound healing of scurvy that isolated camps were genuinely at risk for on diets of salt pork, hardtack, and dried beans. Camps where a cook gathered and preserved huckleberries had measurably healthier men through winter, not because anyone understood vitamin C deficiency, but because the men who ate the berries did not develop the symptoms that those who did not eat them sometimes developed. The difference between the two camps was not luck. It was a cook who paid attention to what was growing on the walk between the bunkhouse and the timber. Number 13. Bracken fern for wound dressing. Pteridium aquilinum. Large fronds, cleaned when gathered from living plants, served as emergency field bandaging when purpose-made dressings were exhausted. The ash of burned bracken contains potassium carbonate, creating a mildly alkaline environment hostile to the acidic metabolism of many wound pathogens. Camp men using bracken fern for wound cover were finding the same pragmatic solution that forest-dwelling peoples throughout the Northern Hemisphere had arrived at independently. Number 12. Oregon graperoot for infection. Here is what the logging industry never formally acknowledged. The medicine that kept camps functional came overwhelmingly from indigenous knowledge, from Haida, Tlingit, Salish, Kinoul, Ojibwe, and Cree practitioners whose botanical pharmacopoeia had been refined across thousands of years on the exact land being logged. The camps with indigenous workers among their crews were most likely to know which resin sealed a wound and which bark reduced a fever. Mahonia aquifolium root bark, unmistakably yellow from its berberine content, was the Pacific Northwest equivalent of golden seal. Coast Salish and Chinook peoples used it for wound infections, eye infections, and intestinal complaints. Logging camp men who learned the plant from indigenous workers found a locally available substitute for golden seal, working through identical berberine chemistry, confirmed antimicrobial activity against MRSA, direct activity against intestinal pathogens, and topical application for infected wounds. The tart blue berries were edible. The yellow root was the medicine. Camps that knew the difference had a resource that others walked past every single day. Number 11. Stinging nettle for joint pain. Deliberately brushing fresh nettle leaves against arthritic joints, a practice called urtication, was used for rheumatic pain in a tradition stretching from ancient Rome through Northwest indigenous practice. Formic acid and histamine injected by the stinging hairs produce localized inflammation that triggers release of anti-inflammatory compounds and increases blood flow to the joint. A randomized controlled trial in 2000 confirmed that stinging nettle urtication significantly reduced pain in thumb arthritis compared to placebo. The sting that loggers cursed every time they brushed against it in the undergrowth, when deliberately applied, became the medicine their joints needed after years of heavy work. Number 10. Thimbleberry leaf for burns and abrasions. Rubus parviflorus, large soft leaves applied directly to minor burns or abrasions, provided a physical barrier and delivered tannins and flavonoids with confirmed anti-inflammatory properties. Camp cooks who maintained dried thimbleberry leaves followed a practice embedded in Northwest indigenous medicine, a plant used as food wrap, berry-picking vessel, and wound covering simultaneously. Camp cooks adopted it not from idealism, but from the practical reality of managing an isolated medical supply with no resupply date confirmed. Number 9. Salt pork poultice for deep infection. This is the remedy that stopped infections in wounds that had no business healing. A thick slice of salt pork pressed against a deep, infected wound and held overnight drew infection toward the surface through osmosis, the high salt concentration creating a gradient that pulled fluid, bacterial cells, and inflammatory debris from surrounding tissue. The salt itself had direct antimicrobial activity against many wound pathogens. Not elegant. In a camp where salt pork was the primary food supply and medical stores were minimal, it combined osmotic debriding action with direct antimicrobial chemistry in a preparation whose only ingredient was already in the larder. Number 8. Wild ginger, northwest for nausea. Asarum caudatum, western wild ginger of moist northwest forest floors, settled the stomach upset that came from camp food of irregular quality, contaminated water sources, and the physical stress of extreme manual labor. Volatile compounds in wild ginger have confirmed antispasmodic properties in gastrointestinal smooth muscle. The campman who chewed a piece of wild ginger root after a meal that was not sitting right was doing exactly what the pharmacology would predict. Number 7. Birch bark tea for fever and kidney complaints. Betula bark tea delivered methyl salicylate and betulinic acid, fever-reducing and anti-inflammatory chemistry through a preparation requiring nothing except bark, water, and fire. Great Lakes loggers working birch-dominated forests of Michigan and Wisconsin had medicine growing in every direction. Birch sap collected in spring provided a vitamin-mineral-rich tonic drink addressing the nutritional depletion that came after hard winters on restricted diets. Number 6. Fiddlehead fern for nutrition. Matutia struthiopteris. Spring fronds provided iron, potassium, and omega-3 fatty acids in concentrations that made them the nutritional reset after winters of preserved food. The harvest window was 2 weeks. Miss it, and the fern hardened and became inedible. Camps where the cook knew to gather fiddleheads at the right stage came out of winter measurably better than those that did not. Not because of medicine, but because of nutrition, which is what most of what passes for medicine ultimately comes down to. Number 5. Spruce needle tea for scurvy. A cup of spruce needle tea contains more vitamin C than orange juice. Jacques Cartier's crew discovered this on the St. Lawrence in 1535. Logging camp tradition preserved that knowledge through the centuries that followed. Great Lakes camps with Ojibwe or Cree men among their crews were more likely to know this than those that did not. It was another instance of indigenous nutritional knowledge keeping European-descended workers alive in conditions that European-derived food traditions had not prepared them for. Number 4. Cottonwood bud oil for muscle pain. Black cottonwood and balsam poplar buds infused in lard delivered aspirin-equivalent anti-inflammatory compounds through the fat base, along with direct antimicrobial action against wound bacteria. Great Lakes and Pacific Northwest camps both maintained this preparation, a convergent discovery reflecting the consistent pharmacological value of the Populus genus. 2 logging cultures, thousands of miles apart, working different timber and different climate, arrived at the same preparation from different trees in the same family. Number 3. Cascara bark as the medicine chest anchor. Beyond its laxative properties, aged cascara bark addressed the liver complaints and digestive sluggishness that came with months of camp diet. The bitter compounds stimulate bile production and liver function through a mechanism that goes beyond simple catharsis. Shaker communities began selling commercially prepared cascara in the 1870s, giving logging camps access to standardized preparations when their own supply of properly aged bark was exhausted. The plant that the logging industry encountered as a forest weed in the Pacific Northwest became, through the Shaker commercial infrastructure covered in the previous episode, a standardized pharmaceutical product available by mail order. Number 2, sword fern for bleeding and wound cover. Polysticum munitum, large stiff fronds wrapped around a bleeding wound and held with strips of torn clothing, served as an emergency field dressing when purpose-made bandaging was not at hand. Sword fern frond ash contains potassium carbonate with mild antimicrobial properties. The plant that covered more square footage of Pacific Northwest forest floor than almost anything else was the default field dressing of the industry, removing the forest it grew in. Number 1, the camp cook, the most important medical professional in the timber industry. The camp cook maintained field surgical kits, kept records of what worked, and developed protocols for the specific injuries that logging produced. Injuries no medical textbook addressed. Not formally trained. They were trained by consequence, by the requirement to solve problems that no one else in the camp could solve, in conditions that allowed no delay and no referral. The knowledge they carried was not written down. When the camp closed, the cook moved on, and the knowledge moved with them, or it did not move at all. Everything on this list passed through their hands. 25 remedies from the most physically dangerous civilian occupation in American history. The men who survived did so partly because somebody in the camp knew which resin sealed a wound, which bark reduced a fever, which berry kept scurvy from taking hold before the supply road opened in spring. That knowledge came from the indigenous peoples whose forests were being logged, and it was never credited, never compensated, and almost never recorded. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. The old growth is mostly gone. The knowledge almost went with it.